Check, checkmate, check. Ready to go? All right. Technical difficulties. Sorry, good morning. Happy Mother's Day to all of you mothers out there. We are getting ready, and already the very first line of the notes is a typo. This is at least week 25, at least. I think it's week 25, not 23. The date's right? And we are just going to start Daniel chapter 5. And remember when we talked about the dating of the writing of Daniel, one of the more important features was chapter 5. There were several things in this chapter that really give credence to a 6th century BC writing versus a 165 BC writing that liberal scholars would hold to. Remember, that's the Maccabean view, that the book was written after all of these things took place. And the classic view is Daniel wrote it in about, during the events around 600 BC. So we talked about that a long time ago. What are the contributing factors in Daniel 5? We just want to review just a couple of those, the major ones. All of them were discussed way back in week 2, so I encourage you to go back. I don't know whether those have been posted yet on our new Splash app, whether we go that far back just yet, but the crew's working on it. So brief review for some of the evidence of the classical view that Daniel was written about 600 BC. One of the first ones that concerns the person of Belshazzar himself, the king of Babylon here in chapter 5. Critical scholars have long, and some of them still hold the view, that Belshazzar never existed. He was not a historical person. And they basically scoffed at Daniel's words here, and they didn't believe really any of it, and mostly because Belshazzar, up until about the middle of the 19th century, was not mentioned in any extra biblical literature or information anywhere. And of course, for a critical scholar, because it's in the Bible is not good enough. You have to find it someplace else to even, make a story believable. Well, it turns out in the 1850s, there were 4 cuneiform cylinders, clay cylinders, that were found with writing on it. And these were in the temple of the moon god in Ur. And one of the cylinders contains this inscription. It says, "For me, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, save me from sinning against your great Godhead, and grant me as a present a life long of days. And as for Belshazzar, my firstborn son, my own child, let the fear of your great divinity be in his heart, and may he commit no sin, may enjoy happiness in life." Okay? Direct. And who was Nabonidus? Nabonidus was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the father of Belshazzar here in chapter 5. Even though Nabonidus is not mentioned in chapter 5, Belshazzar is. So there is a ancient cuneiform tablet that Nabonidus wrote, or in his time frame, that mentions his son Belshazzar. Okay, that was one of the major archaeological discoveries in the 1850s. I'm one who believes that, if we really need a significant biblical archaeological find, all that has to happen is a liberal scholar come out and say it doesn't exist. And sure enough, in a couple of years, that will be found, and it will be a major discovery. Happens time and time again in archaeological studies, okay? Not only that, but since the time of that discovery, there's something like 36 other texts that have been found that give direct evidence of a person named Belshazzar that was the king of Babylon. Okay, speaking of king of Babylon, that really is the second objection that we talked about. Critical scholars would not see Belshazzar as king. Okay, they look at certain sequences of the kings of Babylon that they've reconstructed from their own evidences, and they skip Belshazzar because he's not found in any extra biblical citations or so. Okay, well, in 1920, the verse of Nabonidus was discovered, and from that text, we learn that Nabonidus went on a journey. He left Babylon, and before he left, he entrusted the kingship of Babylon to his eldest son, and his eldest son, his firstborn son, was Belshazzar. Okay, note that particular inscription saying that Nabonidus went away and left Belshazzar in charge, that really gives very strong evidence for the 6th century writing of Daniel. Okay, why? Because the reward that Belshazzar was going to offer, someone that could interpret the handwriting on the wall that we'll see, was the third ruler in the kingdom. Okay, who was the first ruler? Nabonidus. Who was the second ruler? Belshazzar. All he could offer was the third ruler in the kingdom. Okay, and why that's interesting is that over time in Greek literature, Belshazzar was not found by the time of around 165. So he was forgotten about totally in history. It'd be like, who was the wealthiest person in the United States in 1870? Oh, no, he was forgotten. Who is that? We'd have to go look that up, right? And figure that out if we could even do it. But whoever that was has just been forgotten. Nobody writes about that person. Okay? Same kind of thing. By the time the year of Alexander the Great and the Hellenization of the Middle East with the Greek culture and language, by the time historians in that strain began writing, Belshazzar was forgotten. Okay, so it's very unlikely that somebody writing in 165 would include the name Belshazzar here. He was forgotten already. But was it unlikely for someone that lived in the 6th century to know that there was a person and a king named Belshazzar? Yeah, if you were there and witnessed to the actual events that happened, and then later on it was discovered, wow, there really was a king named Belshazzar. Yeah, it's strong evidence for the 6th century BC writing of the book of Daniel. Okay, now what's this trip that Nabonidus went on that he wrote about in the verse account? Well, somewhere around 555 BC, he led an army kind of outside Babylon to the west of Babylon to quell some kind of insurrection or so. And he left the kingship to Belshazzar. It turns out that Nabonidus was fairly fond of desert living. He liked the desert, didn't like the city. It'd be like country folk versus city folk. Okay, I would hate living in New York City, but some of you would love living in New York City. I like the country. Same kind of thing. Nabonidus preferred, kind of the solitude of living in the desert. And so he constructed a royal palace in the city of Tema. And I put this is a map from Isaiah's time, about 100 years before the events here. And you can see where Babylon is right there. That's the Euphrates River coming. And you see kind of southwest of Babylon is Tema in the Arabian desert. Well, he set up a palace there. And he just preferred to live in the desert. So he was the king of the empire. Babylon he wasn't fond of it. It was also discovered through lots of writings that he was not very fond of all the Babylonian gods. He had one of his favorites, and I think it was the moon god. He was partial to that god for his religious faith, and lots of shrines and temples in Tema to his god. So he set up a palace there, and he lived there for lots of years of his life, and that makes sense that Belshazzar was considered the king of Babylon. Okay. Lots of writings that have been discovered that attest to this, that Belshazzar was really the king in Babylon, and he was the one that was acting as the regent for the empire. All right, so he settled there. Again, no Greek author mentions Belshazzar, and what I did was to kind of help us get a handle on the family tree. I extracted this diagram at the bottom of page 1. I'm gonna have to take my glasses off to even read it. Sorry about that. I really wanted to squeeze that in and not, this space to the next page. So if you look at the bottom of page 1 and you look at this family tree, this is from Garland, from his website. You say that Nabopolassar, he was really the founder of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, and Nebuchadnezzar was his son. So Nebuchadnezzar became certainly more famous because of his building and certainly the events in his life that the Lord God did. But you can see that Nebuchadnezzar had a son, a direct son, called Emiel Marduk. Emiel Marduk, remember last week when we talked about who was in charge of the empire, who was in charge of the kingdom while Nebuchadnezzar flipped his wig and went insane. May have been his son here, Emiel Marduk. He may have been the one that kind of is in charge. Perhaps the queen with Daniel's help. Lots of different things, but that's the first time we've heard of Nebuchadnezzar's son. Now, apparently, Nebuchadnezzar also had daughters because there were two other individuals. Neriglissar, he was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, so Neriglissar, he obviously married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, and also Nabonidus. Nabonidus, Belshazzar's father, was also a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. He married another one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. Okay, so that's where the lineage comes from. That's why in the biblical text it says that Belshazzar, references Nebuchadnezzar as his father. Okay, simple fact that in Hebrew and Aramaic there is no word for grandfather. The word father was used to represent any descendant in the line. Okay, and obviously Belshazzar was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar by marriage. So it was proper for Nebuchadnezzar was the father of Belshazzar. And Daniel even mentions that. You knew all of these things that happened to your father. Okay, so that's kind of the family tree here, the lineage. In a couple of pages, we'll talk about how it passed down, how the kingship passed down. It's a lot of intrigue and things like that. So it's interesting there. Okay. All right. One of the other interesting facts about Daniel chapter 5 and really the structure of Daniel itself. Realize that Daniel, when he compiled the book, he decided to put his dealings with the Gentile kingdoms in chapters 1 through 6 all together. Chapters 7 through 12 were his visions that he received personally, apart from any of the kings or stuff. But if you look at when some of those things happened, it actually turns out that Daniel's vision in chapter 7 and his vision in chapter 8 happened before the events of chapter 5. Okay? That's an important distinction here. These things happened before chapter 5. And how do we know that? Well, if you go to chapter 7 and look at verse 1, Daniel tells you, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, he had this dream. Okay? Chapter 8. In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, I had this vision. Okay? So, Belshazzar had ruled really a total of like 10 to 15 years. So it was sometime between him becoming the king and Nabonidus going away and the events of chapter 5 that Daniel had his visions in chapter 7 and 8. Okay? You want to keep that in mind. Okay? You want to keep that in mind because as we come to chapter 5, there are some things that Daniel knows and probably Belshazzar himself knows through Daniel's instruction. Okay? Kind of going into the events of chapter 5. Okay? So, he's already had the visions in 7 and 8. Here are the things that he knows, a bulleted list of the things that Daniel knows prior to the events of chapter 5. Okay? He knows that the kingdom of Medo-Persia would overthrow Babylon. Okay, how did he know that? Well, partially that vision in chapter 2 that he interpreted for the king. Okay, he certainly got some information there. And also in Old Testament prophecy in the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah, there are other sections that also attest and also prophecy that the Persians, the Medes, would come and overthrow Babylon. So Daniel already knew this was going to happen. He already knew this was going to happen. He also knew that a person named Cyrus, and by the time of chapter 5, Daniel already knew about Cyrus, that he would be the one to initiate the release of the Jews from their captivity, and he would be instrumental, Cyrus would, in allowing the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. After the Jews went back, he would allow them to construct that, even though Israel at the time would be part of the Persian Empire. He would allow that to take place. Now, very interesting, the name Cyrus is actually used in Isaiah chapter 44 and 45, and it describes that Cyrus is going to be the instrument that God uses to judge the nation of Babylon. Okay, very interesting. Calls out the name Cyrus. Now, how far ahead of time was that? Isaiah was how long before the events of chapter 5 in Daniel? At least 100 years. At least 100 years. The name Cyrus is called out in the text of Scripture 100 years before he comes on the scene, and Isaiah describes him as the instrument God would use to judge Babylon. The overthrow of Babylon would enable the Jews to return to Israel. Daniel certainly knew that. He also knew from Jeremiah chapter 27 that the reign of Babylon was going to end with Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And who was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson? Belshazzar was his grandson. He knew that the reign was going to end. Okay? Did he know that it was going to end here with the events in chapter 5? Don't know, but he knew it was close. And he also knew that the 70-year captivity for the Babylonian exile was nearing the end of its fulfillment. The years have gone up. It's probably been, certainly coming up on 50 or 60 years by the time chapter 5 came along. And at the end of the captivity, the 70 years, that's when they would go back to Jerusalem. That time was very close, and we'll see that in chapter 9 that Daniel recognized that. He had another vision in chapter 9. Okay? So these are the things that Daniel already knew, And there's no reason to think that he didn't instruct his wise men concerning the two visions and dreams that he had prior to the events in chapter 5, those dreams in 7 and 8. And it may be that Belshazzar was instructed by Daniel also in some of these visions in chapters 7 and 8. That's at least possible that he was able to instruct them. Okay? A couple other interesting tidbits before we really get into the text here. And I got to watch my time today. In chapter 5, why? Actually, let's read the first four verses to get the context of the comments that I'm going to start going through here. There's still some background information. Chapter 5, Belshazzar, the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels, which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, addresses his father, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then he brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay? So it's an interesting thing. Why did Belshazzar specifically request or decide he was going to desecrate the Jewish temple articles of worship? Okay, goblets and cups and things like that were used in the priestly worship. Why would Belshazzar single out the Jews, their accoutrements of temple worship? Why not other countries and nations? Surely that temple, the treasury of Marduk, that Nebuchadnezzar filled up with articles from other nations and stuff, surely there were lots of things from other religions and other countries, foreign countries, that were in there. Why did Belshazzar single out the Jewish accoutrements? Okay, very interesting. Well, here's some things we know. First, the text later on, when Daniel is explaining what's happening here with this writing on the wall, Daniel says that Belshazzar knew about the happenings in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. He knew all of these things. He knew what happened he knew about the dream in chapter 2. He knew about how God humbled him in chapter 3 with the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the burning bush. He knew about the Son of God in the fire. In chapter 4, he knew that Nebuchadnezzar was humbled by God after he was struck with an insanity that plagued him for 7 years, and he regained his senses and praised the God of the Bible. He knew all of those things, okay? Specifically, he knew what the predictions were for the Gentile kingdoms in chapter 2. He knew that there was a kingdom that was going to come after the Medes and the Persians, okay? After Babylon, okay? He knew these things. Second, it's actually been found, lots of ancient documents that actually say that the Persian army had already surrounded and conquered much of the Babylonian Empire by the time of chapter 5. The Persians had already surrounded Babylon, the city, were already, had defeated much of their army. They were outside the walls of the city, ready to come in and attack. Okay, that would really explain why there were so many officials, thousands, that were still in the city of Babylon. They probably couldn't go anywhere. They were stuck there because the Persian army had surrounded Babylon, and they were about to, overtake it. Okay, Why is this interesting? How could Belshazzar throw a party if the Persian army and the Medians are surrounding Babylon? Wouldn't that mostly give cause for alarm? Well, not in this case. Why? Well, Nebuchadnezzar actually constructed Babylon not just as a city, but probably one of the greatest fortresses that has ever been constructed. Okay, the outer wall was so thick you could ride a 4-horse chariot and turn it around up there on top of the wall. Okay, so there's no way that any battering ram or hammer, any device in ancient time for smashing walls down would be useless. The wall was, so wide that you wouldn't smash through that in a million years. Okay. Secondly, not only was there that huge outer wall. Okay, one of the things I didn't put in the notes that I read after I read the notes is there was a secondary inner wall that was just about as high, not quite as thick, but soldiers could stay up there with arrows and just pick people off if they tried to, climb over the wall. And between that first primary outer wall and the secondary wall was a moat, went all the way around. Okay, going to be very difficult, to climb that wall, swim over the moat, and then climb up the second wall. Almost impossible there, okay? Well, what about if they were sitting out there, what would the people do for food and water? Surely the Persians and the Medes could just outlast the Babylonians. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, very resourceful, he actually constructed the main walls and the secondary walls for the city of Babylon over the Euphrates River. So the city had a constant source of fresh water supply. Okay? Water was not an issue. The river flew under the walls, and they could get water whenever they want to. And the storehouses that they had within the city were so large that Nebuchadnezzar had a 20-year supply of food, not just for himself, but for all the inhabitants of Babylon. That's a prepping plan, right? 20-year supply for all the people in the city of Babylon. Okay? In light of all of that, the fortress walls and the fresh water supply and the food supply, how worried were the Babylonians that the Medes and the Persian army was outside Babylon, surrounding it? Probably not very worried. And that really gives credence to why is it, that Belshazzar could throw a party with the Medes and the Persian army surrounding Babylon. Okay, well, I think it's kind of clear that what again, if we go back to the question, why did he ask for the Jewish worship accoutrements and those things? I think it was his purpose to mock God. Okay, it was to mock God. I'm going to single out these Jewish things. Why? Because I know about this prediction that the God of the Jews made concerning the overthrow of this kingdom. Look at this kingdom. We have an impenetrable fortress with a 20-year supply of food and water. We're not worried a bit. Bring those Jewish instruments here. Let's drink out of them and have a good time. It's not worried, okay? Again, what's one of the major themes of the book of Daniel? Pride. Pride, and we see that. Okay? All right, how are we doing? About 15 minutes. Okay. Next kind of introductory question. When did these events happen? When did the events of Daniel chapter 5 occur? Well, we know exactly when Babylon was overthrown. There's documents and that kind of stuff that happened that we'll get into, but It occurred in the year 539. It's about 24 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar died in 563. And that was about 30 years after the king's madness. These events are happening, okay? And Babylonian history tells us about just kind of the disorganization and the intrigue and very unstable government conditions after Nebuchadnezzar died. Some very interesting things that have happened here. So if we go to the table on page 3, we can kind of highlight. I pulled this from Garland as well. And some of the things that are interesting in here is you've got the kings that are down here, the names. You got the relation to the other kings, the length of their rule, and how did their rule end? Okay, very interesting. So again, Nebuchadnezzar, he was the son of Nabopolassar. He ruled 43 years and he just died. Okay, simple death. Daniel chapter 1 through 4 describes Daniel's ministry during Nebuchadnezzar's time. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar's true son, Marduk, he reigned after Nebuchadnezzar for about 2 years. Okay, and here's where the intrigue comes up. Okay, Marduk was murdered by Neriglissar, okay, one of Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-laws. Just, murdered, and he took the kingship, okay? He was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, Neriglissar, okay? He ruled for 4 years, and then he was killed in battle, okay? And his son, his true son, Labishi Marduk, he ruled for a couple of months only. And then turns out Nabonidus, who was Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law by marrying one of the daughters, he murdered this son of Neriglissar, and he took the throne. So he ruled only a few months before Nabonidus murdered him and claimed the throne. Okay? He ruled 17 years, and during that time is when Belshazzar also ruled, kind of as a co-regent. Okay, so lots of intrigue, lots of reminds me of that old Star Trek episode, Mirror Mirror, where people ascend to the command by assassination. Same kind of stuff here in ancient Babylon. Okay, ancient Babylon was very common for one ruler to take the throne by assassinating the previous one. I just find it interesting that this all happened within the same family, great family there you got, killing each other for the power, okay? So let's set the historical, setting just a little bit here. It's kind of summarized good by Walvoord in his commentary. I make one correction. In the very end, I put correction as mine. He has Nabonidus there instead of Belshazzar. I just made the correction for him there. So he says, thanks to the Babylonian Chronicle, the date of Belshazzar's feast can be determined with a high degree of precision. The Chronicle states that on the 16th day of the month, Tishri, in Nabonidus' 17th year, okay, and that was Saturday, October 12th, 539 BC. Okay, an exact date can be given for that. The army of Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle. Okay, Herodotus notes that Babylon fell during a time of festival or celebration. Sounds like what Daniel's writing about. Okay, this corresponds closely with Daniel's description of the fall happening the night Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his lords. Now, does anyone remember way back when the historical events? How did Cyrus actually get into the city of Babylon and kill the king here in chapter 5? Yes, he blocked the Euphrates River and steered it off in another direction so that the water now did not flow under the wall. It dried up, and his army walked right under the wall into Babylon. Basically, I mean, Babylon was a huge place. It's like New York City. So it's unlikely, because they didn't have CNN during those days, that the army could go in and siege part of the city without the throne room ever even knowing about it. Okay, so eventually the Persians went in and took over the whole place, and it's here, the very last moments of Belshazzar's life here in Daniel 5, that's when that happened. Okay, and recall that some historians basically said that the fall of Babylon by the Medo-Persians kind of happened without much of a battle. There was almost no battle at all, and they went in and did their duty. Okay. All right. Got about 10 minutes here. Let's go ahead and start with. So, any questions on that's the setting, background, all of that kind of stuff? Any questions or comments concerning the background? Okay. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Okay. Talked about, why would he hold a feast? He certainly, felt pretty secure, but, why would he hold a feast at this time with the Medo-Persian armies bearing down on him? He certainly wasn't that worried about it. But, perhaps he was just trying to, encourage and build morale and calm the people down with the Persians outside there, ready to rumble here. He's just trying to settle them down, calm them down. Hey, let's have a party. Let's drink some wine. It's all take a breather here and take a deep breath, that kind of stuff. Okay. It's also possible, and history also tells us that his father, Nabonidus, he was actually involved in some of the warfare outside of the city of Babylon prior to the events in chapter 5. He was defeated and he fled. He's gone, probably fled back to Tema. Okay, so I'm sure word probably got to the people in Babylon that the king has just been defeated and he fled. He's gone. Maybe Belshazzar threw the party kind of as, this is my coronation. I'm the king now. My father's gone. He was defeated in battle. He's gone. I'm now the king. Maybe, certain little bit of that. Okay. Or it could have just been a annual festival that just happened to lie on this date. No real information here other than the king threw a great feast. Okay, lots of different possibilities here. The point being that none of the people that were at that feast were going anywhere because the Persians had surrounded Babylon. Okay. It says that he was drinking wine in the presence of his 1,000, rulers, and most expositors would kind of take that to mean that he somehow sat on an elevated platform, sat on a stage or a throne or a table, much like how we put, the bride and groom table in front at your reception hall so that everyone can see them and they have the prominent place for that day and all that kind of stuff. Similar thing, the king was out there front and center, probably sitting on an elevated platform, and the king was drinking wine in the presence of those people. Okay, and interesting that the drinking of the wine really seems to be kind of the highlight of the issues and stuff here. And you might entertain the implication that had Belshazzar not been drinking wine, he probably would have reconsidered how wise it was to go get the Jewish accoutrements and desecrate them by, drinking wine out of them. Okay, certainly that's Montgomery comments the king, he must have lost his sense of decency to commit what is to the Oriental view a sacrilege, even with the holy things of another religion. Okay, even the Babylonians, as pagan as they were, respected the religious articles of foreign gods and stuff. They didn't desecrate them. They at least respected that. Okay. 2 through 4, when Belshazzar tasted the wine, okay, almost kind of say as he not just tasted it and got the idea, pretty good chance he's inebriated here. He's drunk. He tasted the wine, and then he gave orders to bring the gold and the silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. The king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. And they drank the wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, the Babylonian gods. Okay? Again, Belshazzar, he's drunk. He gets the idea, hey, go get these temple vessels. And, he lost his better judgment. And he said, go bring them. And interesting that at least 3 abominations in the Lord's eyes were occurring here. Okay, first one was the drunkenness. Okay, you got 1,000 rulers. It's safe to believe that all the rulers and Nebuchadnezzar's wives and his concubines, they're all drunk. They've all been drinking wine. They're all drunk. Second, since the concubines were mentioned, it's fairly likely that eventually, as the night went on, there would be sexual immorality going on too. Okay, that's certainly probable. And third, blatant idolatry. Drinking toasts to other gods with the Jewish vessels. Clearly idolatry. We recall that the Babylonian view of warfare and conquest and religion is one nation could not overthrow another nation unless their gods were more powerful. So with the Babylonians here, kind of sitting back, almost impregnable in the city because of its fortress nature, and having those accoutrements in the temple was an indication that, at least in Belshazzar's view, that the Babylonian gods were more powerful than Yahweh. Okay, and he threw this feast. Okay, again, why did he single out the Jewish accoutrements? I think specifically to mock God. Okay, to challenge God's prediction of the overthrow of Babylon. Okay, I just find that interesting and ironic how Cyrus actually got in the city. Okay, I mean, fine. Yeah, fine. It was an impregnable wall. Fine. There was a moat there. Fine. They had all kinds of fresh water, that kind of stuff. From the outside looking in, sure looked like it was impregnable. Okay, but God in his sovereignty and his wisdom, allowed Cyrus to come up with this brilliant plan to divert the Euphrates River and just walk under the wall to get in there. Okay, certainly the Babylonians would have never envisioned that. Okay, I think that's just the sovereignty of God in the events of Daniel chapter 5 that aren't recorded there, but history records it. Okay, so any event, the king certainly has this vile idea in his mind, brought on by the wine, and it's certainly true that many times, otherwise clear-thinking men, people, can have an evil thought in their heart and not act on it until they take a little bit of wine. And then all of a sudden, it becomes easier, to enact what they've already, determined and desired, the evil in their heart. Okay? It's no wonder that Proverbs 31, written by Solomon, what does he say? It is not for kings to drink wine, and it's not for princes intoxicating drink. Okay, Solomon himself is explaining the virtues that kings should not be drinking wine. Why not? Because they wield so much power in their rulership that if they were to become drunk, they may start abusing the people or doing all kinds of idiotic things. Okay? I wish our congressmen and rulers would take heed these words of Solomon in Proverbs, because I kind of get the idea that they get a lot of their ideas for evil legislation over dinner parties and stuff like that. But for another time. Okay. The text tells us, just an interesting point, not really relevant, I don't think, that Belshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and the silver vessels, but it only says that they brought the gold vessels out. Okay, so the command was, bring me the gold and silver vessels, and apparently they only brought the gold ones back. That's not hard to believe. What was the Babylonian view of gold? Yeah, gold was the most precious metal in Babylon religion. Nebuchadnezzar certainly used gold quite a bit. Much of the gold, or much of the stuff in Babylon was gold. Their gods they fashioned out of gold. Marduk, the main Babylonian deity, was the god of gold. All of these things. Not surprising that, when they went in there to get them, they said, just leave the silver, take the gold. Let's drink with the gold. Okay, certainly possible. Okay. One final thing, and we'll cover this in 1 minute, and we'll have finished the notes barely. Some of the vessels, interesting note, some of the vessels used in the temple service, if you go back into Numbers, the instruction for the Aaronic and Levitic priests, some of those vessels were so holy that only the Aaron priests could touch them. And the penalty was death for anyone else to touch them, namely the Levites. Okay, it was death. So the question is, how was it that Nebuchadnezzar's army could touch them and bring them out of the temple and take them to Babylon and put them in the temple treasury of Marduk, most likely? Okay, how's that possible? Well, I think the answer lies in God's sovereign purposes. If you recall, if you go back to Daniel chapter 1 in the first verse, okay, it says in the second verse, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. So God gave Nebuchadnezzar those vessels as well as the king. He gave them to Nebuchadnezzar, okay, as part of his sovereign judgment on the nation of Israel. Okay? He certainly was able to do that. Okay, it's also interesting that for that entire time, up until the events of chapter 5, there's no indication that Nebuchadnezzar desecrated those temple articles at all. He just kept them in the temple, kind of as a testimony to the power of Marduk, his god, over Yahweh. And of course, we know that through those chapters 1 through 4, eventually Nebuchadnezzar, changed his mind about all of that stuff. So, unfortunately for Belshazzar, he picked the wrong time and place to get a belly full of wine. Okay? And he was able to enact out what was clearly in his heart. And that section ends in verse 4 with all the people kind of raising their glasses, drinking toasts to all the gods of Babylon. And we'll pick it up next time with verse 5. It starts out suddenly. Suddenly. And we'll see exactly what happens. And again, there's also some evidence for the 6th century writing of Daniel here in the plaster of the wall, if you recall that, the excavation. They found the white plaster. Daniel actually includes something that would seemingly be an irrelevant fact to a 165 writer of Daniel, okay, but to a 600 BC writer, it was relevant, and archaeology is again confirmed. Daniel was written in 600 BC, not 165 BC. So, all right, it's amazing that I only needed 50 minutes to cover that. I thought it would take a lot longer. If you've got some or forgotten some of the things, you can go back to week 2 and look at some of the evidence for the classical view of writing in 600, and especially some of the stuff in chapter 5 that's really relevant for that dating. So, closing comments, questions. Chapter 5 is very interesting. Very similar to what happened in chapter 2 and in chapter 4. Daniel comes to interpret something for the king, and this time it's very bad news for Belshazzar. And we'll see that next week. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I'm not sure where it stood, but one of the things that Saddam Hussein, Chris is asking the question, didn't Saddam Hussein in his days try to rebuild Babylon? He did, and there are some pictures you would see out there. I don't know whether he has fully tried to reconstruct the Ishtar Gate, but he used some of the same blue stone type things that is believed that Nebuchadnezzar used in his building, certainly some gold. But yes, Saddam Hussein did want to rebuild Babylon. And of course, my view is that Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18 does not refer to a allegorical Babylon. I think it refers to a literal Babylon. So I think that Babylon will be fully restored someday. Yes?
I think I've heard that the United Nations are looking to move out of New York City, and they're looking to move to Babylon, that area.
Okay, comment was the United Nations wanting to leave New York City. That's a win-win for us. Certainly there'll be some empty real estate there and stuff, but they want to move the headquarters to Babylon, the prospect. Why would they want to do that, by the way? Why would the United Nations, get it? United Nations want to move to Babylon, right? There's history there. That's where, it may even be a mocking, mocking of God to move to Babylon. You're the one that confused all our languages. We're going to come all together and go back there to mock you, Certainly possible. But you would at that point think if the United Nations wants to move to Babylon, well, that'd be rebuilt in a hurry, wouldn't it? So. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Yep. So there's some interesting things, very similar. We could see some things happen Okay, but in terms of what we believe about the rapture being an imminent event, does Babylon have to be reconstructed and fully built up before the rapture? No. Could it be? Yes, it's possible, but it's not necessary. It's not necessary. So, okay, we better go. It's 10 after. Good class, dismissed.